Welcome to Convention of States, a project of Citizens for Self-Governance. Well, now that we've covered the Convention of States basics, let's focus on just what is Article 5. We're going to talk about how Article 5 was developed. We're going to talk about understanding the language that went into Article 5, and then just exactly what does Article 5 say. The term convention. What does the term convention mean to you? Well, in traditional Anglo-American political usage, a convention is an assembly convened to address short-term political problems. There were also multi-government conventions that soon became popular. Those were for addressing intercolonial problems. And history shows us that at least 30 had been held between the years 1689 to 1776. Today, we call a convention really a task force. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along here. Back in the day, conventions were of two categories. First of all, within a colony or state, these were conventions to address issues within the individual colony or state. And preceding the Revolutionary War, such conventions pretty much assumed governance of the colonies. Well, there was a second category, and that was the multi-government gathering or convention. The multi-government convention was held to address issues involving interstate issues, later referred to as committees of states or convention of states. So basically, conventions were really problem-solving events. Many of the framers were veterans of prior interstate gatherings. The protocols, by 1787, protocols for multi-government gatherings or conventions were pretty well standardized and generally accepted. The procedure involved the sponsor of the convention drafted a document referred to as a call or an application, specifying time, place, and subject matter. Very important, subject matter. The sponsor then directed the call or application to the parties that it wished to invite. As far as commissioners and rules are concerned, we'll get more into these topics at our next meeting. But for now, each state determines how its representatives or commissioners are appointed, and upon convening, the convention then would elect officers and adopt rules. But as I said, we'll get into these more at our next meeting. Now that we understand a little about the language and generally accepted protocols of the day, let's look at a few significant people involved in the Article 5 process. Colonel George Mason has been credited with insisting on the inclusion of Article 5. And I just want to read some of his quotations here. Amendments, therefore, will be necessary. It would be improper to require the consent of the national legislature because they may abuse their power. No amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive. Now, he had further support from the Federalist Papers. James Madison said in Federalist 43, either the federal or the state governments can originate the amendment process. Also, Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 85 said, "We may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority." Well, I want to take a little commercial break here if I could. Before we move on, I would like to take a moment and ask if you are wanting to learn more about our Constitution and founding, may I suggest Hillsdale College online courses. These courses are all online and free. Courses are offered on the Constitution, Federalist Papers, progressivism, economics, and many more topics. So I highly recommend you take advantage of this program. Okay, let's actually read what Article 5 says. The Congress, whenever two-thirds of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of two-thirds of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of three-fourths of the several states, or by conventions in three-fourths thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So it's key to understand here that Article 5 provides us two methods of proposing amendments to the Constitution. One method originates in Congress, while the second method originates in the states. Well, let's take a look at the first method. The Congress, whenever two-thirds of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of three-fourths of the several states, or by conventions in three-fourths thereof. This method is what we have normally accepted as the way amendments are proposed and added to the Constitution. If we look at it in the graph form, amendments are proposed by two-thirds of Congress and then sent to the legislatures for ratification by three-fourths of the states. Let's now look at the second method in Article 5. The Congress, on the application of the legislatures of two-thirds of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of three-fourths of the several states, or by conventions in three-fourths thereof. This is the method that we now want to use. Now in method 2 in graph form, we see that amendments can be proposed by a convention of states, which is called by two-thirds of the state legislatures, or in our case now, that would be 34 states. Any proposed amendments then are sent to the states for ratification, which, as in method 1, requires three-fourths of the states to ratify, or 38 states. So to sum things up, Article 5 allows Congress or a convention of states to propose amendments subject to ratification. Two-thirds of the states may call for a convention of states to propose amendments to the Constitution for the states to consider for ratification. 3/4 of states must ratify. And what Article 5 does not allow is a runaway convention, because for the simple matter that 3/4 of the states, or 38 states, must ratify anything that is proposed at the convention. Congress interfering is not allowed. All Congress does is set the time, date, and method of ratification to be used by the states. At our next meeting, we'll talk about what is a convention of states. We'll get into some history, some precedent, opposition, rules, commissioners, as I mentioned earlier. So the next meeting will focus on just what is a convention of states. In closing, I would like to leave you with this quote. The founders gave us a legitimate path to save our liberty by using our own state governments to impose binding restraints on the federal government. It is time to dust off the tool the founders gave us in Article 5 and get started. Thank you.